In the spring of 1945, the island of Okinawa had become a battlefield. The once tranquil landscapes, known for their quiet villages and peaceful traditions, were now engulfed in the brutality of war. The island was caught between two forces, the advancing American soldiers and the determined yet increasingly desperate Japanese defenders. Okinawa had become a symbol of the final line of defense before the Japanese mainland, a place where civilians were caught in the crossfire of a conflict they never asked for. Many of the island's residents sought refuge in the numerous caves that dotted the landscape. These limestone caves, once a natural haven, now served as hiding places where families crammed together in silence, their lives reduced to the simple act of survival. For most, the war had already claimed everything: their homes, their belongings, and their sense of security. Now, all they could do was wait and pray that they wouldn't become casualties of the relentless battle above ground. Inside the caves, there was no sound but the faint echoes of coughing, the soft rustle of shifting bodies, and the occasional sob from a child too young to fully comprehend the horrors unfolding outside. The civilians hiding in these caves lived in constant fear. The Japanese soldiers, though few in number, had issued stern warnings against surrendering to the American forces. The idea that the Americans were inhumane, cruel, and merciless had been drilled into them by years of propaganda. These civilians had been taught that surrender was a betrayal, and, worse still, that it would bring death in the most brutal form. Yet, as the days wore on and the supplies ran out, that fear began to feel less like a safeguard and more like a sentence. The civilians were left with a haunting choice: to hold on to their beliefs and die in the caves, or to risk their lives by venturing out in search of food, safety, or mercy. Sachiko Nakamura, a mother of two, sat at the back of one of the caves, her body curled protectively around her children. Her hands trembled as she held her youngest, a baby named Haru, who had been growing weaker with each passing day. Her daughter, Yuki, barely 8 years old, was nestled against her chest, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Sachiko hadn't eaten in days. Her body felt distant, disconnected from her own actions. The air in the cave was thick with moisture and the pungent smell of decay, a constant reminder of the conditions they were enduring. Yet, in her heart, she still carried a flicker of hope that somehow her family would survive this nightmare. The people in the cave had long stopped speaking. The fear that gripped them had stripped them of their voices. They no longer whispered words of comfort or shared memories of better times. The thought of surrender, of asking for mercy, was too dangerous to even consider. The Japanese soldiers who remained had warned them that any sign of weakness would be punished. The threat of American soldiers was another fear they couldn't escape, but the terror of their own countrymen had become just as suffocating. They were prisoners not only of the enemy outside, but of the lies they had been told for years. The children in the cave had grown eerily silent. Some had stopped crying altogether, their faces gaunt from hunger, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. Yuki had begun to speak less and less, as though every word drained her. Haru had stopped moving altogether. Sachiko tried to wake him, but he lay motionless, his tiny body growing colder with each passing hour. Her heart ached as she gazed at her son, but she had no more tears to shed. She had become numb to the pain. Grief and hunger had dulled her emotions, and all that remained was the brutal fight to keep her children alive. Outside the cave, the world raged on. The explosions and the sound of American aircraft were a constant reminder of the war that surrounded them. But inside, time seemed to stand still. The only thing that mattered was survival, the desperate hope that they would somehow make it through the next hour. The air in the cave felt heavy with the weight of lost hopes and unspoken fears. Every moment seemed to stretch on endlessly. The children clung to their mothers, their small hands reaching out in search of comfort, but there was nothing left to give. Sachiko held Yuki close, her lips pressed to the girl's forehead, and waited. She didn't know what for. A miracle that seemed increasingly out of reach with each passing day. Days turned into weeks, and the people in the cave were running out of options. The rainwater they collected in rusty cans was their only source of hydration, but even that was scarce. Every drop was precious. Some of the older residents of the cave had already succumbed to the conditions, their bodies stiff and unmoving in the corner, their spirits leaving them quietly, without ceremony. No one had the strength to bury them. The sense of loss and hopelessness was palpable, yet there was nothing to be done. They were too weak to fight, too scared to surrender, and too tired to keep waiting for the war to end. At night, the sky above was lit up by the flashes of explosions, and the ground trembled with the force of distant battles. The leaflets that occasionally dropped from the sky promised food and safety, but no one trusted them. The propaganda machine had done its job too well. The civilians believed that the American soldiers would only bring more suffering, more death. The fear that had been instilled in them over years of military rule had taken deep root, and now even the thought of survival was overshadowed by the belief that surrender meant certain death. The fear of the unknown was more powerful than the hunger in their stomachs or the cold in their bones. Sachiko had lost all sense of time. Days bled into each other, indistinguishable from one another. The line between life and death seemed to blur. She could no longer tell when one ended and the other began. All she knew was that her children were still alive, and that was enough to hold on to. As she held Yuki, her body numb with exhaustion, she whispered a prayer, one she had not said in years. It was a simple prayer, a plea for strength, for survival, for the will to keep going, even when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. But deep down, she knew that the war was far from over, and that the future she once dreamed of was now as distant as the horizon. The war above them raged on, but for Sachiko and her children, it was not just the battle outside that they had to endure. It was the war within, the war against hunger, against fear, and against the overwhelming uncertainty that consumed their every moment. They didn't know what the next day would bring, or if there would even be a next day. All they could do was hold on to each other, cling to that fragile thread of hope that somehow they would survive long enough to see the end of it all. As the days stretched on in the cave, the heavy silence that enveloped the survivors became almost unbearable. It was a silence that had grown so thick that even the smallest sound seemed like an intrusion. The only noises that could be heard were the soft groans of the sick, the coughs of the children, and the occasional shuffling of feet as people shifted uncomfortably in their spots. The cave, once a symbol of refuge, had become a prison of despair, a place where hope seemed to fade with each passing hour. Sachiko's body, weakened by days without food, had become an almost unrecognizable shell. Her skin clung to her bones, her hands trembling as she cradled her daughter, Yuki, close to her chest. The little girl's eyes were dull, void of the bright curiosity that once characterized her. Yuki no longer asked questions or showed the usual signs of wonder. Instead, she sat silently, too weak to even speak. Sachiko knew the end was drawing near for her children, but she dared not voice the thought. To do so would be to admit that everything they had endured had been for nothing. Despite the overwhelming exhaustion, Sachiko couldn't sleep. Each night, as the world above continued to burn, she remained awake, listening to the distant rumblings of the war. It felt like the world had become a constant noise, an endless barrage of destruction, but it was the silence inside the cave that gnawed at her. The silence of people who had given up hope. The silence of a place where life was slipping away, one breath at a time. Outside, the war was being waged with increasing intensity. Explosions echoed across the island, shaking the very ground beneath them. Yet inside the cave, time seemed to stand still. The horrors above, while terrifying, felt distant, as if they belonged to a world far removed from the small space they occupied. There was nothing to do but wait. And waiting, Sachiko realized, was the hardest part. The waiting for something to change, for someone to come, or for the end to finally arrive. It was the uncertainty that weighed on them all. Every few hours, someone would get up to drink from the rainwater they had collected in the old, rusted cans. But even this small act was done in silence, as if speaking aloud might attract the attention of the enemy. It was almost as if everyone had forgotten what it meant to be human, to be alive, and not merely surviving. The food they once took for granted was now a distant memory, a luxury they could no longer even imagine. The elderly in the cave were growing weaker by the day. One old woman, who had been frail even before the war, had stopped moving days ago. No one dared to bury her, for there was no strength to dig, no energy to spare. Her body, once a source of wisdom and comfort to the others, now lay cold in the corner, surrounded by the faint smell of decay. But even in her death, the people refused to acknowledge her passing. It was as if doing so would make it all too real, too final. They had already accepted the inevitability of death, but to face it directly was too much. The children, those who had not yet succumbed to hunger or disease, were the most heart-wrenching to watch. Their skeletal forms moved slowly, with little energy, but their faces still held the innocence of youth. Some had stopped crying altogether, too weak to shed tears. Others, like Yuki, had become quieter and quieter, each passing day taking more of their spirit. It was as though the war had robbed them of everything, even their voices. Sachiko had often tried to comfort her daughter, speaking softly to her, but Yuki rarely responded. Instead, she simply lay there, clinging to her mother as if her very life depended on it. Sachiko, in turn, clung to her daughter as if Yuki was the last thread of hope she had left. She wondered if, in some small way, her love for her children was enough to keep them alive. But the rational part of her knew that love alone wouldn't be enough to survive in these conditions. Still, she held on, as if somehow, by sheer will, she could will them through this nightmare. It was becoming harder and harder to ignore the truth. They were running out of time. The food, what little of it remained, was almost gone. The few cans of food they had scavenged from nearby homes were nearly empty. What little water they had left was becoming tainted. The others in the cave seemed to sense it too, the quiet acceptance that death was coming, one way or another. The air was thick with it, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and shared understanding. It was a death not just of the body, but of the soul, the slow, inevitable death of hope. As the days blurred into each other, Sachiko thought of her husband, who had gone off to fight long before the invasion had reached Okinawa. She wondered where he was now, if he was alive or if he had been swallowed by the war. She thought of the life they had once had, of their home, of their future. It seemed like a distant dream, something that could never have been. Now, in the dark corner of this cave, surrounded by the dying and the hungry, the thought of a future seemed impossible. The only future was the one that existed in this cave, a future of waiting, of pain, of death. Yet, in the deepest recesses of her heart, Sachiko refused to completely give up. She refused to believe that the world, with all its cruelty, could leave no room for hope. Somewhere, deep inside, she held on to a fragile belief that if they just waited long enough, someone would come. Someone would offer them a way out of this hell. But as the days wore on, that hope began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of inevitability. The world had forgotten them, and the war was not going to stop until it had consumed them all. The cave, with its damp walls and its suffocating air, became a symbol of their isolation. It was no longer just a hiding place. It was a tomb in waiting. A place where people, too exhausted to resist, gave up on life, surrendering to the cold grasp of death. Yet, even in this place of resignation, there were still moments, brief and fleeting, where a flicker of life would push through. Yuki, despite everything, would sometimes hold her mother's hand, her tiny fingers wrapping around Sachiko's like a lifeline. In those moments, Sachiko held on to her, praying silently for a miracle. But the silence that filled the cave only seemed to grow louder as the war continued to rage above them. The days continued to stretch into an unbearable eternity. The small group of civilians hiding in the cave had grown accustomed to their fragile existence, to the slow erosion of their hope, their spirit, and their will to live. The hunger had become so deeply ingrained in them that it no longer felt like an affliction, but a constant companion. Their bodies had adapted, or rather resigned themselves to the slow, gnawing pain. The moments when they could feel anything beyond the constant ache were few and far between. But somehow they continued to exist, locked in a battle not with the enemy above, but with their own bodies, their own minds. Sachiko had stopped counting the days. Time no longer held meaning in the depths of the cave. The sun had become an abstract concept, something distant and unreachable, a memory of another world. The only real markers of time were the endless rumbles of the war above and the occasional flutter of the leaflets that fell from the sky. These leaflets were often mistaken for signs of hope, but in the eyes of the people in the cave, they were nothing more than cruel reminders of the outside world they could no longer touch. The words on the paper, promising food and safety, had no meaning. They were just another lie, another deception to keep them from surrendering. Yuki's condition continued to worsen. Her once bright eyes, filled with the curiosity of childhood, had dulled into glassy orbs, distant and vacant. The weight loss had left her nearly unrecognizable, a small, frail figure who clung to her mother as though she might disappear completely if she let go. Every day, Sachiko watched helplessly as her daughter's spirit seemed to fade a little more. Yuki no longer spoke. The occasional whimper was all that remained of the child she once was. Sachiko longed to hold her close, to whisper reassurances, but there were no words left. Her own heart was too heavy with grief to offer comfort. Haru, the baby who had once been a bundle of joy, now lay still in his mother's arms, his tiny body colder and more lifeless with each passing day. The small flicker of hope she had once held for him had extinguished, leaving nothing but an overwhelming sadness. She hadn't tried to wake him again. She knew that it was too late, that his tiny body had given up long ago, but part of her still clung to the hope that, somehow, he might open his eyes. She had seen the signs of death in his stillness, but she couldn't bear to let go of that last, fragile thread of hope. The others in the cave were no better off. They had long stopped trying to comfort one another, as though words were a luxury they could no longer afford. The elderly, once the protectors of wisdom and tradition, had begun to succumb to the harsh conditions of the cave. The smell of death had begun to permeate the air, a constant reminder of the toll this war had taken on them all. Yet no one spoke of it. The dead were left to rest, untouched, as if to acknowledge them would be to confront the reality they were all avoiding. Despite everything, Sachiko felt a strange sense of duty to stay awake, to stay vigilant for a miracle. She couldn't explain why, but she continued to watch over her children with unwavering attention. Even though she was barely holding on herself, she couldn't let go of the role of mother, of protector. Her love for them was the only thing keeping her from surrendering to the despair that surrounded them. Each time she looked down at Yuki, each time she glanced at Haru's still form, she reminded herself that they still needed her. She could not let them down, even if the world outside was already lost to them. Her thoughts wandered to the leaflets that had drifted down from the sky a few days before. They were often discarded without a second thought, their promises of safety too distant to believe. But this one had been different. The words, printed in bold, seemed to mock them. Food, shelter, and safety await. They were sent by the Americans, the enemy, yet they were offering what her people had been desperately craving. Sachiko had been taught to believe that the Americans were monsters, cruel and unforgiving. Yet the idea that they might offer salvation was impossible to ignore. Could it be true? Could the enemy be offering mercy where her own government had failed? Her heart wavered with uncertainty. The propaganda had shaped her entire worldview, but she knew deep down that it was all lies. She had seen the soldiers, heard their stories. They weren't monsters. They were human, just like her. The war had twisted everything into something unrecognizable, but the idea that there could be kindness amid all this horror seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Could she trust them? Could she trust anyone anymore? As she held her children close, she felt a deep sorrow for the life they had lost. The children, once full of energy and joy, had become mere shadows of their former selves. The laughter that had once filled the air in her home was gone, replaced by the hollow sounds of death and despair. The pain of seeing her daughter, her son, wither away before her eyes was unbearable. Yet, even as she mourned them, even as she feared for their future, she felt an inner strength rise within her. It wasn't enough to change their fate, but it was enough to keep going, to keep holding on to whatever shred of life they had left. Outside the cave, the war raged on, but it seemed so distant, so irrelevant to their immediate reality. The soldiers above, the explosions, the cries of battle, they were part of another world, a world that had already passed them by. The reality of life in the cave was far more immediate. There was no room for politics or strategy. There was only the desperate need to survive, to hold on just one more day, to keep hope alive even when it felt impossible. And so they waited, not for victory or defeat, but for the mercy that seemed so out of reach. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity, yet no one dared speak of the end. To speak of it would be to acknowledge that there was no escape, no hope. And in the cave, where hope was already a fragile thing, acknowledging the truth would be too much to bear. So they waited, each in their own silence, holding on to whatever they could. Days began to blend together in the cave, the constant dampness and hunger making it nearly impossible to distinguish one moment from the next. The survivors, what few there were, had long ago stopped keeping track of time. It was as if time itself had abandoned them, leaving only the suffocating stillness. Sachiko could barely remember when it had all started, the retreat into the caves, the warnings, the fear. Now it all felt like a dream, a nightmare with no end in sight. Her body was no longer just weak from hunger. It felt foreign to her, like she was floating in a fog, disconnected from the life she had once known. Yuki had stopped speaking altogether. Her eyes were sunken, and her once energetic demeanor had been replaced by an eerie quiet. She no longer whimpered, no longer asked her mother for comfort. Sachiko didn't know how to reach her anymore. She had held her daughter close, whispered softly to her, but the words fell on deaf ears. It was as though Yuki had already started to retreat inside herself, away from the horror, away from the world. Sachiko tried to hold on to the last vestiges of her daughter, but the child she had known was slipping away, just as Haru had. Haru's tiny body had become even more lifeless, and though Sachiko continued to cradle him, she knew there was no hope. His once soft skin had turned cold and pale, his little limbs stiff. He had not made a sound for days, not even a whimper. She couldn't bear to look at him, but she could not let go either. She continued to stroke his hair gently, as though he could somehow hear her, as though he could somehow feel her touch. The reality of what had happened to him, to them all, seemed too much to comprehend, and yet here she was, trying to hold her family together when it felt as though everything around her was falling apart. The air in the cave was thick with a sense of resignation. The others, too, had retreated into their own silence. Even the elderly, who had once been a source of strength and wisdom, had fallen into a state of quiet acceptance. Their bodies, frail from age and the brutality of the war, had begun to weaken at an even faster rate. There were no tears left to shed, no energy left to mourn. The once vibrant voices of the children were replaced by the quiet sobs of the old and the sick. The faint smell of decay began to mix with the musty air, but no one had the strength to bury the dead. It was as though, in the face of everything, they had all given up on the idea of burial. The bodies would simply stay where they had fallen, their spirits lingering in the silence. One morning, as the others huddled together, trying to preserve what little warmth remained, a small noise broke through the silence. It was barely audible at first, but then it grew clearer, a soft, rhythmic sound. It wasn't much, just a tapping, a scratching at the cave entrance. At first, no one moved, too accustomed to the idea that any noise outside the cave was a threat. But after a few moments, the tapping became more insistent, more urgent. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to get their attention. Sachiko's heart raced as she looked around. The others, too, had begun to stir, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The fear was palpable, as each person silently wondered what this new sound meant. Was it the enemy? Or was it someone from the outside world, trying to find them? The possibility that someone might still be out there, that there was still a chance for them, seemed too impossible to consider. And yet, the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, almost as though it were a signal. After what felt like an eternity, the noise suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, almost unbearable. No one spoke. No one moved. They all waited, holding their breath, praying that the sound would return, that it was a sign that help might be coming. But the moments stretched on, and nothing happened. The tapping had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind only the haunting echo of what might have been. No one dared to move or speak. The reality of their situation, of their isolation, was too overwhelming. In the stillness that followed, Sachiko's mind raced. Could it be the Americans? Could it be true that they were offering them mercy? She had heard rumors, whispers in the cave of the leaflets that had fallen from the sky, the promises of food, of safety. But those had all been dismissed as lies, tricks to lure them out of hiding. Yet now, in this strange moment, a flicker of hope ignited within her. She wanted to believe. She wanted to believe that the war could end, that there could be something more than death, than destruction. But even as she dared to hope, another part of her resisted. The propaganda had done its work so well, the fear was so deeply ingrained that she couldn't shake the nagging doubt. The idea that the enemy, the Americans, could offer them food, safety, mercy, it seemed too much to believe. Her mind was torn between the possibility of salvation and the brutal certainty of the life they had known in this cave. The others, too, began to stir, their eyes shifting between one another in the dim light of the cave. The silence was broken only by the soft shuffling of feet and the occasional whispered question. But no one dared speak openly. The fear of being heard, of attracting attention, was still too strong. Yet, in the back of their minds, the idea that someone might be offering them a way out began to take root. Could it be true? Could there be salvation waiting just beyond the darkness of the cave? As the moments stretched on, the air in the cave grew thick with uncertainty. The tapping had stopped, and with it, so had the fleeting hope that had begun to take shape. But something had changed. The possibility of mercy, of salvation, had entered their minds, and no matter how much fear clung to them, no matter how impossible it seemed, it could not be erased. The war had taught them to expect only death and suffering, but for the first time they allowed themselves to imagine a different ending. Even if it was just for a fleeting moment, the thought that life might return, even here, in the depths of the cave, was enough to stir